The question is that this bill be now read a second time. I call the member for North Sydney.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. And Mr Speaker, Mr Deputy Speaker, I rise to oppose this piece of legislation. The piece of legislation that is flawed in both policy and in fact. And we do that, Mr Deputy Speaker, as a coalition because we, in many ways, having come from the real world of commercial banking or coming from the real world of the financial services sector, understand what it means for the government to enter into a market, understand what it means when the government enters into the financial services industry. And, Mr Deputy Speaker, I reflect on my own experiences in this regard as, in part, a guiding light to the position that we are taking today. I began my legal career as a banking and finance lawyer in the late 80s, early 90s. And at that time, the law firm that I was working with, a major Australian law firm, was charged with mopping up the failed State Bank of Victoria, and in particular was responsible for unwinding numerous transactions involving the finance arm of the State Bank of Victoria, Tricontinental. Some of the deals, Mr Deputy Speaker, were extraordinary. Extraordinary deals being run through jurisdictions around the world to minimise tax, in fact, in the end, in many cases, to avoid tax. But significantly, in the case of Tricontinental, they used the state government balance sheet to extend credit to people who should not have been lent that money. And I reflect on the State Bank of South Australia and the fact that it too, like the State Bank of Victoria, had a long history extending into the 1800s. And once again, the failure in that case of the State Bank of South Australia, with liabilities that only officially are on the record at over $3 billion, but in actual fact were closer to 10. The State Bank of South Australia was in the business of lending money to people who should not have been lent money. In both the cases of the State Bank of Victoria and the State Bank of South Australia, many of these loans were secured against commercial property where the borrower themselves had little or no exposure to the risk associated with the venture. And of course, Mr Deputy Speaker, the experience of the Labor Party in Western Australia is also well documented. WA Inc. Itself a detailed record, yet again, of the reasons why governments should not get in the business of direct lending to individual companies on a scale of the proportions that is currently before this House. The Prime Minister has given it the title Australian Business Investment Partnership Bill. What codswallop? What codswallop? It is a banking bill. Even the previous member over there from the Labor Party just referred to it as a bank. It quacks like a duck, it waddles like a duck, it is in water, it is a bank. And the only thing that separates this from the title of bank is that this is not supervised by the Australian Prudential Regulation Authority as an authorised deposit-taking institution. It is not. Instead, not only is it not properly supervised by APRA, as a bank would be, but it is specifically excluded from the Trade Practices Act that allows the shareholders and directors to collude, which would normally the case be in breach of the Trade Practices Act. And it goes further, Mr Deputy Speaker, whilst I'm on the issue of corporate governance. there are no independent directors. There is only one director, who is the chairman, who is guardian of the interests of the most exposed shareholder to this entity, the Commonwealth Government. And my leader, the member for Wentworth, earlier in this debate, laid down all the very good reasons why we are opposing this legislation relating to the detail of the bill. But I do want to specifically refer to some of the particular items in the legislation. And if we separate out, Mr Deputy Speaker, a lot of the guff associated with the interpretation of the legislation, the bill that is before the House, can you pass me a copy of that? Section 7 of the legislation, Section 7, which I recollect of the legislation before the House, refers specifically to two items which will be the objects of the legislation. The first item deals with commercial property. And the commercial property aspect, Mr Deputy Speaker, specifically says that the commercial property should be financially viable. And the second aspect of which, and there is no defined term associated with financially viable. I mean, what financially viable may be is open to the interpretation of the shareholders and the board. But the second subsection 7.2, a further object is to provide financing in other areas of commercial lending through financing arrangements of a kind agreed to by the members. Carte blanche. Whatever you want, here is $30 billion, of which $28 billion comes from the Australian taxpayer, or is guaranteed by the Australian taxpayer. And this single section here, section 7.2 of this bill, is the most damning indictment of the Rudd government that we have seen in the last 18 months when it comes to seeking the opportunity of this parliament and the will of this parliament to give them carte blanche to spend as they choose. Section 7.2 basically says, well, we want a blank cheque from the Australian taxpayers to go into the business of lending. There are no restrictions. There are no restrictions. So that effectively means that this entity, with the agreement of the banks, of course, and we'll get to this in a moment, the balance of the relationship between the banks and the Commonwealth Government, but with the agreement of the entire entity, Rudd Bank can lend money to anyone for any purpose, under any circumstances, and that very broad definition allows this entity to go to places where, in all truth, Mr Deputy Speaker, the banks themselves do not want to go. And when we asked the government during the briefings, well, isn't this simply going to be the case of the four major banks in Australia abrogating their responsibilities to an existing borrower and instead substituting through Rudd Bank the Commonwealth taxpayer? And the response was, well, in the shareholder agreement, there is an agreement between the four major banks and the Australian government that the four major banks, if they have an exposure in an existing syndicate, will maintain their existing ratios in relation to those exposures. So let us, for example, take the situation where there is one of the major banks has an exposure as part of a syndicate to a major